5 years after he walked out, my son returned, not for forgiveness, but to hand me a gun, a fortune, and a suicide mission. Now, armed with my dead father's final secrets, I realize I'm not just cleaning up Michael's mess, I'm the final decoy in his escape plan. The smell of stale coffee and desperation usually clung to my armchair by mid-afternoon, but today, the air in my tiny apartment felt sharper, almost electric. I was staring at the chipped paint on the windowsill, watching the dust motes dance in the weak November sun, trying to calculate if I could stretch the last of the instant ramen until Friday. It had been 5 years since Michael left, 5 years since he'd slammed the door of our rented duplex, his face a mask of entitled fury, shouting that my small life was suffocating his potential. He was 22 then, armed with a degree I'd paid for with 10 years of graveyard shifts and an unshakable belief that he deserved the world on a silver platter. I sacrificed everything for that potential, Anya. Everything. My name is Robert. I'm 58 now. I work part-time stocking shelves at the Mega Mart, long enough hours to keep the landlord off my back, but not long enough to earn me a pension. The silence in the apartment was the loudest thing in my life, a constant reminder of the void Michael left, a void that only got bigger the less I heard from him. I remember the last time I saw him before today. It was Christmas, 3 years ago. He showed up, borrowed $50 for gas, and vanished again before I could even offer him pie. He didn't call on my birthday. He didn't call when my appendix burst last spring. I was just background noise, a failed investment. I sighed, running a hand over my thinning hair, and looked at the worn photograph on the mantelpiece. Michael, beaming, gap-toothed, holding up a mediocre fish he'd caught on that one family vacation before things got tight. He looked happy then. He looked like my boy. Suddenly, the quiet was violently shattered. It wasn't the usual city rumble. This was an aggressive, expensive sound, a low, throaty growl that vibrated through the thin floorboards right up to my worn soles. It sounded like money, loud, unapologetic money. I shuffled over to the window, peering through the gap in the faded curtains. My breath hitched, lodging somewhere behind my ribs. Cruising slowly down our dilapidated street, the kind of street usually reserved for beat-up sedans and delivery vans, was a machine of obsidian black. It was low, sleek, and utterly incongruous here. A European sports car, the kind you see in glossy magazines you can't afford to buy. The windows were tinted so darkly it looked like liquid shadow on wheels. It slowed down, the throaty purr dropping to an impatient idle directly in front of my building. Then the driver's side window slid down with an almost silent, electronic hiss. The interior light flickered on, illuminating the driver. It was Michael. But not my Michael. This Michael was immaculate. His suit jacket, I could tell it was tailored silk even from this distance, was the color of midnight. His hair, once a messy mop, was now sculpted, perfectly framed above cheekbones that looked sharper, colder. He wasn't just wearing a watch. He was wearing an artifact on his wrist. He glanced up at my window, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, immediately replaced by something that looked suspiciously like pity. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stared, his expression completely flat. He reached over, tapped the dashboard twice, perhaps signaling someone in the passenger seat, and then he leaned out slightly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence after he cut the engine's rumble. "Took you long enough to look up, Dad," he said, his tone dry, almost bored. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, and the coldness sharpened into something cutting. You really should try living your own life, Robert, instead of just waiting for mine to start." He hit the accelerator. The tires squealed in protest against the cracked asphalt as the black beast roared away, leaving nothing but the lingering stench of expensive exhaust fumes and a ringing silence in my ears. I stood there, gripping the curtain rail so hard my knuckles were white, the words echoing, "Live your own life." He had the audacity, the sheer, blinding arrogance to lecture me on living, me who had worn myself down to bone to finance his potential. The insult, the utter dismissal, was a physical blow. I turned away from the window, my mind a buzzing hive of adrenaline and righteous fury. 5 years of silent nursing of that old wound, and he just drove by to salt it. I walked past the stained armchair, past the stack of overdue bills, and stopped dead in front of the hallway closet. I hadn't opened it in years. It was where Dad had kept his old military footlocker, the one thing he insisted on keeping when he moved in with us. I fumbled with the stiff latch, pulling the heavy, dark green metal box out into the light. It smelled like old canvas and machine oil. It was locked, of course. Dad had always been meticulous about security, but I knew the combination. I'd watched him punch it in 1,000 times during my childhood, a ritual he performed whenever he was anxious. My fingers, clumsy with nerves, found the cold brass dials. I spun them slowly, deliberately, the rhythmic click-thunk sounding deafening in the small apartment. 22, 10, 36. The latch sprang open with a sharp metallic crack. I threw the heavy lid back, bracing myself for disappointment. Perhaps just old uniforms and faded letters. But the contents weren't what I expected. Nestled beneath a folded wool blanket wasn't the expected historical artifact, but a modern, gleaming object wrapped in velvet cloth, alongside a sealed envelope addressed to me in my father's familiar, spidery handwriting. I pulled the velvet bundle out first. It was heavy. I tore the cloth away, and the light caught the dull sheen of metal, heavy, cold, and utterly unmistakable. It wasn't an antique. It was a service weapon. And tucked beside it, nestled in the foam, was a spare magazine and a single crisp sheaf of $100 bills, more cash than I had seen in one place in 2 decades. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the envelope. Michael's words echoed again. Live your own life. Maybe Dad knew something I didn't. Maybe he always planned for the day I'd need to stop surviving and start living. I picked up the letter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely break the wax seal. The first sentence was stark. Robert, if you're reading this, it means my final contingency plan has been initiated. Michael is not who you think he is. You need to follow the instructions in the lockbox immediately, because whoever is driving that car is about to discover that this apartment isn't as empty as it looks. The paper in my hand felt brittle, like old parchment. I forced myself to focus on the script, ignoring the sudden deafening roar of my own blood in my ears. Michael's threat, the gun, the money. It was too much information, too fast. I smoothed the letter against my knee and began to read my father's words, his familiar, comforting cadence, fighting through the terror the sight of the weapon had invoked. My dearest Robert, if you have opened this box, it means I am gone. And more importantly, it means Michael has reached the age where his true nature has become apparent. I had hoped I would be here to guide you through this, but life, as always, is unpredictable. That car you saw, that is the manifestation of the path he chose. It is not his own achievement, Robert. It is stolen. Stolen. Michael was ruthless, certainly, but a thief? I thought of the expensive suits, the casual disdain, the way he'd always hinted at lucrative deals he was too busy for to explain. I skimmed further, my eyes snagging on a technical term I barely understood. The consortium. They don't tolerate failure, and they certainly don't tolerate those who embezzle from their legitimate fronts. Michael was never meant to inherit. He was meant to manage the overflow. He took what he shouldn't have, and now they are coming to collect. Not just the money, Robert. They are coming for loose ends. A cold sweat broke out across my back. Loose ends. That was me. The abandoned, aging father in the derelict apartment complex, easily dismissed, easily silenced. The next paragraph was a set of precise, almost military instructions. My father, who had only ever worked as a city plumber before his honorable discharge decades ago, had apparently been playing a very long, very dangerous game. The weapon is a relic, but it is clean and functional. Use the cash to acquire a prepaid phone and a burner laptop. Nothing traceable. Go to the bus station. You have precisely 3 hours before they triangulate the last ping from Michael's last authorized transaction, the one he used to show off to you. He made a mistake by coming here today, but it buys you a slight head start. 3 hours. The digital clock on my dusty microwave blinked 2:17 p.m. The sun was already beginning its slow descent. I looked back at the open safe. The gun felt heavy and wrong in my grip. I was a man whose greatest domestic challenge was unjamming a jammed automatic can opener. This was beyond my capabilities. But then I looked at the address written beneath the instructions. Go to the only place they won't look for you. Agnes's Diner, Route 17 South. Ask for the blue plate special. If the waitress, a woman named Clara, gives you the correct response, she will guide you. Agnes's Diner. That was 40 miles away. I shoved the money and the letter into the inside pocket of my threadbare coat, my mind racing to execute the plan. I had to move now. As I reached for the heavy footlocker lid to close it, hoping to hide the evidence of my sudden, desperate mobilization, my eye caught something else tucked into the side compartment, something that hadn't been visible when I first opened the box. It was a small, rectangular, tarnished silver box, engraved with initials that were definitely not my father's. They were an elaborate, looping M and C. Curiosity, the same fatal flaw that had kept me tethered to hope for 5 long years, overruled my common sense. I flipped the catch on the silver box. Inside, there were no documents, no more cash, only a single old-fashioned key, the kind used for heavy-duty padlocks, and a small, folded piece of paper. This note was written on high-quality linen stock, clearly not from my father. The handwriting was sharp, almost aggressively neat. Robert, your father thought he could hide everything. He couldn't. He owed us for the damage Michael caused, damage that extends far beyond the missing funds. The key opens the lockbox at the Union Depository, Safety Deposit Box 412. You have exactly 1 hour from the moment you read this to retrieve what is inside, or we start dissolving your assets, starting with the meager life support you currently cling to. This wasn't a threat from the consortium. This felt personal, immediate, and terrifyingly specific. Someone else knew about the footlocker. Someone else was tracking me. And they knew about the other safe deposit box. I checked the microwave clock. 2:35 p.m. I looked wildly around my cramped living room. How did they know about the Union Depository? Dad had never mentioned a second account. I grabbed the heavy gun, suddenly feeling the weight of true danger settle over me. I needed to get out, But now I had a ticking clock attached to a mysterious second secret that might be the key to saving myself or signing my death warrant. I threw on my coat, the wad of cash heavy in my pocket, the gun warm against my side. As I reached the front door and turned the deadbolt, I heard it, the faint but unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel just outside my window again. Not the roar of Michael's luxury vehicle this time, but the heavier, more utilitarian sound of a large sedan stopping too close to the curb. I froze, my hand inches from the doorknob, listening intently. Then I heard the slow, deliberate thud of a car door closing, followed by the distinct rhythmic squeak of expensive leather shoes approaching the walkway leading directly to my unit. They weren't wasting time. They knew I had opened the footlocker. They were here for the silver box. The squeak of those expensive leather shoes on the coarse gravel was the soundtrack to my sudden, stark realization. I was trapped. The letter from my father explicitly stated I had 3 hours before the consortium's general sweep, but this second threat, the one linked to the silver box and the Union Depository key, was clearly a specialized immediate response. They were already on the premises. I backed away from the door, my mind screaming for an exit that didn't exist. My apartment was a ground-floor unit, a fishbowl on a busy corner of the complex. One window faced the parking lot where the sedan had stopped. The other, the dusty view of the alley where I'd seen Michael drive off earlier. The footsteps paused directly outside my door. I held my breath, the heavy firearm feeling suddenly clumsy in my sweaty palm. I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of metal scraping against metal. A lockpick, or perhaps a thin jimmy bar. They weren't knocking. They weren't announcing themselves. These people operated on the assumption of immediate access. Robert Peterson? A voice deep and utterly devoid of warmth cut through the wood. It was too close. We are aware you have something that does not belong to you. Open the door, and this can remain a simple retrieval. Retrieval. They made it sound like reclaiming an overdue library book. My gaze darted desperately around the room, the back window to the alley. It was small, framed by a rusted security grate that hadn't been maintained since the Reagan administration. It was my only chance. I crept silently toward the kitchen, placing the silver box containing the mysterious key and the linen note onto the counter. I gripped the pistol tighter, trying to channel the cold, distant fury I'd felt looking at Michael's expensive car into something productive. I shoved the chair under the kitchen window and began wrestling with the corroded screws holding the grate in place. They were impossibly tight, rusted solid by years of indifferent weather. My fingers slipped, scraping skin against metal. Each scrape sounded like a gunshot in the tense quiet. "Mr. Peterson." The voice outside deepened, growing impatient. "We're done waiting." A violent, shuddering thud hit the front door, rattling the hinges. The wood near the lock groaned ominously. They were escalating to force. I gave one final, desperate wrench on the top screw. With a shriek of tortured metal, the screw head sheared off. The grate shifted slightly. I yanked it hard, tearing away a jagged section of the rusty frame, creating a gap just wide enough for a thin, middle-aged man to squeeze through, provided he didn't mind a few more cuts. Just as I began to contort my body to slip through the opening, the front door exploded inward. It didn't just crack. The entire frame buckled, wood splintering as a heavy impact splintered the deadbolt assembly. 2 figures rushed in. They weren't large men. They were lean, wearing dark tactical vests that indicated serious business. The man who had spoken, taller, with eyes that swept the room like security cameras, had a compact automatic weapon held low and ready. "Stop right there, Peterson," the leader barked. I was halfway through the gap, my coat snagging on the broken metal. I didn't have time to turn, let alone aim the pistol that was still dangling near my hip. I pushed forward violently, scraping my ribs raw against the jagged edges of the window frame. A burst of sound erupted behind me, not the controlled rat-tat-tat of the automatic weapon, but something sharper, heavier, followed by a surprised curse from the lead intruder. The muzzle flash momentarily blinded me even as I tumbled out onto the cold, littered alley floor. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline burning away the pain. I looked back frantically, expecting to see the men firing wildly, but they weren't shooting at me. The taller man was clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in shock and pain, staring back through the shattered frame of my kitchen window. The man behind him was backing away, already reaching for a radio clipped to his vest. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the sudden, unexpected chaos, was a third figure. It wasn't Michael. It was a woman. She was impossibly tall, dressed in dark, practical clothing, and she held an old, heavy-caliber revolver, the source of the deafening crack, pointed steadily at the two men who had just broken down my door. She hadn't entered through the front. She must have known the layout, known the vulnerability of the rear entry. She stepped into the ruined living room, her eyes locking onto mine in the alley for only a fraction of a second, assessing my status. "You're the father," she stated, her voice calm, authoritative, and carrying the distinct accent of someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders. "You have the key. Good. But you're late for your appointment with Mr. Peterson's son." She didn't explain. She didn't offer help. She simply stepped over the threshold, leveling the revolver back toward the two injured men. "The consortium is impatient, Robert," she continued, addressing me as if I were already her subordinate. "Union Depository, Box 412. You go now. Take the weapon. If you see Michael before you reach the bank, you use the gun on him. He's already compromised the recovery operation." As she spoke, a new sound drowned out the rising panic, the high-pitched, insistent whine of a siren rapidly approaching from the direction of the main road. Someone must have heard the initial shotgun blast. The woman glanced toward the approaching sirens, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "We have company. Run, Peterson. If you want to know why your son is destroying his life, meet me at the bank. If you're followed, use the first rule Dad taught you. Disappear." She pushed the silver box, the one I had just found, out through the broken window opening, sliding it across the dirt toward my feet. Then she turned, stepped back into the ruins of my apartment, and began speaking urgently into her radio, issuing precise, calm commands as the sirens grew deafeningly close. I grabbed the box, tucking it under my arm, the heavy pistol still in my hand. I had the key, the gun, the money, and a bizarrely capable, armed female stranger who seemed to know my deceased father better than I did, all while two men were about to be apprehended by the police in my living room. I looked down the alley, then back at the woman who was clearly preparing for a violent confrontation, and knew I had to choose: stay and face the police alongside my unknown savior, or flee into the chaos she had just created. The sirens were screaming now right at the mouth of the complex entrance. I had perhaps 60 seconds before uniformed officers flooded the narrow access road. The woman in my apartment, my unexpected gun-toting guardian angel, was still issuing crisp orders into her radio, her back to the shattering reality about to descend upon us. I looked at the silver box, then at the heavy pistol in my hand. "Use the gun on him," she'd said, referring to Michael. This wasn't about retrieving stolen funds anymore. This was about an execution Michael might have already failed to carry out. I chose flight. The idea of explaining a deceased father's footlocker, a mysterious silver box, and a woman currently engaged in a standoff with two heavily armed men in my tiny kitchen was not a conversation I was equipped to have with the local precinct. I darted down the opposite end of the alley, away from the main street where the flashing blue and red lights were already beginning to paint the brick walls. I ran low, fueled by the adrenaline cocktail of fear and the bizarre sense of purpose the silver box had instilled in me. I reached the end of the alley, emerging onto a rarely used side street lined with overgrown hedges. I risked a glance back. The front of my apartment building was now swarming with police cruisers. I could hear shouts, the amplified voice of an officer demanding compliance. I didn't see the woman emerge, but I didn't need to. She had bought me the head start she promised. I headed toward the nearest bus stop, ditching the heavy pistol into a large recycling bin under a pile of flattened cardboard boxes. I couldn't risk carrying it, not yet, but I kept the silver box, clutching it like a lifeline. 10 minutes later, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I reached the Megamart parking lot using the familiar landscape as a shield. I used the cash my father provided, a shocking sum, to purchase a cheap, prepaid phone and a disposable laptop from a far-corner electronics store, making sure the cashier saw nothing but a tired old man buying necessities. Back in the relative safety of the bus station's crowded waiting area, I powered up the burner laptop. The Union Depository was downtown, several districts away. It was a fortress of marble and quiet wealth. I opened the linen note from my father again, reading the instructions concerning Agnes's diner. Route 17 South. Ask for the blue plate special. Clara. I pulled up a map on the laptop. Route 17 was the old interstate, a sprawling, neglected road peppered with defunct businesses. Agnes's diner was an artifact of a bygone era. I managed to catch the 3:45 p.m. regional bus heading south. As the city gave way to tired suburbs and then open country, I tried to process the identity of the woman who had saved me. She knew my father's name. She knew about Michael's betrayal, and she knew about the bank key. She sounded like she belonged to the world Michael had stumbled into, the consortium, but she was actively fighting them. Was she an ally? Or was she simply ensuring I delivered the contents of the silver box to the right person before they disposed of me? The bus ride felt endless. Every shadow seemed to hide an operative. Every slowing car felt like it was tracking me. I kept the laptop lid slightly ajar, constantly checking the rearview mirror. At 5:15 p.m., the bus screeched to a halt near a faded, peeling sign advertising Route 17. The diner was visible half a mile down the highway, a beacon of crumbling neon. Agnes's diner. I stepped off the bus into the biting evening air. The diner looked exactly as Dad had described, a gleaming, albeit slightly tarnished, aluminum structure squatting beside the empty highway. I walked up to the entrance, the silver box heavy in my coat pocket. A small bell chimed cheerily as I pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with the smell of grease, old coffee, and something sweet, maybe stale cherry pie. The diner was nearly empty, just two truckers huddled at the far end of the counter. Behind the counter stood a woman who had to be Clara. She was older than me, with weary eyes and a hairnet holding back a mass of steel gray curls. She wiped down the countertop with practiced monotony. I approached the counter, my voice sounding rusty. "Excuse me," I managed. "I'd like to order the blue plate special." Clara stopped wiping. Her movements froze mid-stroke. Slowly, she raised her head, her eyes meeting mine. There was no recognition, no pity, only a deep, unsettling professional assessment. She didn't smile. She didn't ask what it was. She leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice barely a whisper over the hiss of the deep fryer. "The blue plate special is only served when the regular gravy is out," she said, her eyes darting toward the front window, though no cars were approaching. "And when the gravy is out, we serve the lobster thermidor." My father's note mentioned a correct response. Lobster thermidor. That was an outrageously expensive dish. This wasn't a code. It was a bizarre, elaborate prank. I felt a wave of defeated panic. Had I misread the instructions? Was this a dead end? I don't understand," I stammered. "I was told—" Clara cut me off sharply, her face hardening. "You were told to ask for the blue plate special, Mr. Peterson. That dish hasn't been on the menu since 1998. You failed the first test." Before I could apologize or turn to flee, she placed her hand flat on the stainless steel countertop, pressing down hard. Beneath the counter, a small panel slid open with a quiet click. She didn't pull out a weapon or a piece of paper. She pulled out a small antique leather-bound diary, its cover embossed with the same looping M and C initials found on the silver box. Your father, bless his cautious heart, always loved a contingency, Clara murmured, flipping the diary open to a dog-eared page. He knew you might miss the actual code, but he also knew you'd be carrying this. She gestured with her chin toward the pocket where I'd shoved the silver box. The key is only good for one purpose, Robert. The contents of Box 412 are not what you think. They aren't cash, and they aren't secrets about Michael. They are the original transfer documents, and Michael has already been informed that you are coming for them. She looked up, her expression suddenly grave. He isn't just trying to escape the consortium, Robert. He's trying to frame you for their failure. You walk into that bank vault, you'll find something waiting for you that will ensure you never see the light of day again. Clara's final words hung in the greasy air of Agnes's diner. Frame you for their failure. The lobster thermidor, the failed code, the sudden shift from secret keeper to desperate pawn, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying clarity. Michael hadn't just abandoned me. He had engineered my ruin as a sacrificial offering to whatever dark organization he served. I didn't hesitate this time. The feeling of being hunted, actively manipulated by my own son, was a potent antidote to 40 years of inertia. I pulled the silver box from my coat. "What's in the diary?" I demanded, my voice surprisingly steady. Clara didn't look at the open page. She looked straight into my eyes. "Your father made an insurance policy. The consortium deals in digital assets, shell companies, and leverage. They don't care about physical money, Robert. They care about ownership trails. The documents in Box 412 prove that you were the signatory on the initial holding accounts for Michael's illicit activities. If the consortium finds those papers, you're not just indicted, you're finished." "And the key?" I held up the small, tarnished piece of metal. "The key opens the box containing the decryption sequence. Your father never trusted digital records. The real proof, the evidence that clears you and implicates Michael, is encoded on a physical drive hidden inside that lockbox. But you have to get to it before Michael's other associates do." "Who are you?" I asked, gripping the silver box so tightly my knuckles were white. Clara allowed herself a ghost of a smile, the first human expression I'd seen from her. "I'm the cleanup crew, the one who actually cared about your father. He taught me a thing or two about contingencies. Now go. Use the laptop to hail a legitimate taxi. Do not take a bus or a rideshare. They will be monitoring public transport immediately after the incident at your apartment." I nodded. slipping the diary into my pocket alongside the heavy cash. The decision was made. Union Depository. I was going to confront Michael's trap head on. I paid for a cup of watery coffee, left a 20 on the counter, and stepped back out into the twilight. The highway felt ominous, but I hailed the first taxi that passed. A battered sedan driven by a man who looked entirely too interested in the expensive laptop I was using. I gave the driver the address for the Union Depository, then quickly logged onto the burner, pulling up the GPS. As the taxi crawled south, I watched the real-time map. The location of my apartment complex was flashing red, indicating intense police activity. But a new indicator had popped up. A dark sedan matching Michael's, or the consortium's, was moving rapidly from the city center toward the depository, clearly anticipating my arrival. I calculated the distance. If I could arrive just before Michael's crew, I might beat the clock. The taxi pulled up to the imposing granite facade of the Union Depository. It was 7:50 p.m. The bank was closed, but I remembered my father's letter. He had a plan for that, too. I pulled out the cash and discreetly handed the driver a wad large enough to make him very quiet and very patient. I approached the service entrance noted in my father's final instructions, a small unmarked door next to the loading bay. I used the silver key on the corresponding lockbox I found tucked beside it, retrieving a high-security access card and a temporary security override code. I swiped the card and keyed in the code. The steel door hissed open, revealing a sterile, brightly lit hallway leading to the vaults. As I descended the silent marble staircase toward the basement levels, the heat of the pursuit became palpable. I could feel the presence of Michael's backup closing in. I found Box 412. It was identical to the one my father had kept in the footlocker, heavy, formidable steel. I inserted the tarnished key. The lock turned smoothly. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside, there were no papers confirming my guilt. Instead, there was a single, sleek external hard drive, humming faintly, and a short typed note resting on top. Robert, the documents confirming your liability were never real. They were digital decoys uploaded to the consortium's main server under your fabricated identity 3 years ago. Michael planned to erase you by exposing your complicity when they came for him. The drive you hold contains the counter-exploit, the root access codes to their entire encrypted network. Use these, and you don't just clear your name, you bankrupt the men who funded your son's arrogance. I looked at the hard drive, the power to unravel an entire criminal enterprise resting in my trembling hands. Suddenly, the heavy vault door at the top of the stairs slammed open with a deafening clang. Footsteps echoed rapidly down the marble steps. Too many footsteps, measured and deliberate. Michael's cleanup crew had arrived. I shoved the hard drive into my pocket, snapping the empty lockbox shut, preparing to feign innocence. The lead operative, a brute of a man I recognized from a grainy photo in my father's private files, rounded the corner, his face a mask of lethal intent. He stopped dead when he saw me, unarmed, standing beside the open vault slot. "The key, old man," he growled, raising his weapon. "Where is the decryption?" I looked him dead in the eye, the fear finally replaced by a cold, protective resolve for the father who had protected me until the end. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, raising my hands in surrender. "I just came to collect my father's last belongings." As the operative stepped forward to advance, eager to silence me permanently, the lights in the vast vault flickered violently and then died, plunging the entire level into absolute suffocating darkness. A split second later, just as the emergency lights sputtered back on, dim, eerie green pools illuminating the space. I heard a faint, familiar sound echoing from the stairwell behind the operative, the muffled, electronic chime of a text message notification coming from the disposable phone I'd just bought. I hadn't programmed any contacts into it. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness, distorted and amplified through the vault's internal speakers, a voice dripping with triumph and ice. "Look inside your coat pocket, Father," Michael's voice boomed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The hard drive isn't the only thing you picked up. You see, I knew Clara would send you for the key, but I needed to ensure you delivered the real payload, the one that gets her and me out of the blast radius when the decryption sequence finishes wiping out the consortium's primary server farm. Congratulations, Robert. You just committed digital suicide for me."